Hi everyone, welcome to our short 10 to 15-minute video on Unit 518, Managing Risk. I'm going to hand over to our tutor James, who's going to take you through the assignment. Thanks, James.
Right, so this assignment is all to do with the management of risk. We're going to take this down to each question and describe how we might approach each one of them. There are only two learning outcomes here, which is good, but there is a lot of detail required within these different learning outcomes, which we will run through. So here we're looking to equip learners with that understanding of the scope and purpose of business risk management. We're going to look at what different types of risks are, how we approach the management of those risks effectively, and how the whole thing can be implemented successfully overall. So there's quite a bit going on with this one. Let's get straight in. We're going to understand the scope of business risk management next. First question is to evaluate business risks in relation to the organization, its customers, and suppliers. We're going to advise you throughout your assignment writing to break your answers down to three component parts. The first is to make any key definitions that are required in the question, so to clarify what we mean by key terms and key definitions. The second is to meet the command verb, which is the first word or two in the question. So here you'll see we've got evaluate, analyse, examine, and analyse. So we've got some different command verbs in there which we need to answer differently. And finally, less is more, which is to use just as many different examples or theories or models as we need to do to answer the question. Typically, that number is going to be between 2 and 4 things, just to make sure that we're tight to the question. We're not kind of talking about stuff we don't need to be, but we're doing more than one as well to demonstrate some breadth of knowledge. Let's apply that as we go through. Evaluate business risks in relation to the organisation, its customers, and suppliers then. Now, here, I'm going to suggest you might want to apply this to your own organization, actually, as an evaluation. So you could do two things in this question. One is to look at just generally what kind of business risks might organizations have themselves and their customers and suppliers, but also to make this real and bring it to life by looking at your own organization. And the first thing I would do is just, it sounds obvious, but I would just define what we mean by risk. It's your opportunity, the whole assignment's based on risk. So I think just a nice definition of business risk would be really healthy here. It just lays out some of the different types of risk we might face, what we mean by risk as a thing. So, probabilities of outcome, that kind of thing. You might just put in a good definition of what we mean by business risk to start, because the whole assignment's based on business risk. Once you've got your definition there, we're going to go ahead to then perform an evaluation of business risks in relation to organization, customers, and suppliers. Evaluate is quite an in-depth command verb. It asks you, if I go to our guidance here, to look at the strengths and weaknesses, arguments for and against, similarities, differences, perhaps. We're going to judge from the evidence of different perspectives to make a valid conclusion or reasoned judgment. That's really important. So whenever we see evaluate, it's asking you to have an opinion on the things based on some evidence. This is the big thing, or a reasoned judgment based on the evidence. So when we're going to evaluate business risks, it's okay, how big are the risks? How important are the risks? Not just what the risk could be. So not just a list, but your evaluation of those risks around your organization here to bring this to life. In indicative content, they could be to do with internal process failures. Maybe you've got a key supplier without whom your whole operation falls apart. If you've got a real risk within that because you're over-reliant upon particular supply chains or extended supply chains, for example. It could be that you've got risk in customers failing to pay or changing their spec throughout or changing who they use. You might think also just around generally outside things that could impact the business. So it could be terrorism, it could be cyber attack. It could be, general significant external events that happen that we've got no control that impact us really well. So the kind of typical pest stuff of political, economic, social, technological, etc. Think about availability for finance could change, all that kind of stuff. It'd be helpful to look at your own organization to bring this to life a little bit and evaluate what you think the key business risks would be in relation to its suppliers and its customers to give some appreciation based on some evidence around what you think the key risk could be, the scope of them, the extent of them, all that kind of stuff. So that's 1.1. 1.2 then is to analyse the governance of risk within organisations. We might be making a more general set of points here around how risk is governed. So you might be looking at the kind of typical ISO type accreditations here that might be used to govern. Structurally, how do we do that governance bit? Is it committees, management boards? Is it particular crisis management teams? Who's accountable? Who makes a decision and why and when? It could be through the culture that we set. You can read kind of indicative content, but there's a lot of stuff in there you might bring into this to analyze how governance works in organizations. So we try and squeeze risk a little bit out and govern it. It might be worthwhile here just, again, defining what you mean by governance, because governance has a pretty wide scope as well. Typically, you might think it's to do with accountability and decision flows, particularly, but a little definition of governance might be good here to help you. And your command verb is to analyze the governance of risk. And to analyze, we're looking to break it down to separate parts and examine each part in some detail, trying to identify main issues and how the main ideas are related to practice, why they're important. If you've got any kind of current research or theory to support that, that would be good. You might look at typical ways in which governance might fall down with risk, what might be driving that. Just a brief analysis around that would help to make that something more than just a list of different governance factors. 1.3, examine categories of risk used in different organizational settings. So here, if we apply our definitions, I think it'd be useful to define what those different categories of risk could be. In the indicative content, again, it talks about operational risk, contractual risk, regulatory risk, financial risk, structural risk, cultural and social, brand reputational type risk, all that kind of stuff. So it's just what could be the different types of categories of risk. I'm going to define those things. And we're going to examine each of them, ideally within different organizational settings. That might be different types of organizational context. So it could be, you might think around public sector, private sector, third sector, for an example, or it could be maybe different risks start to come to the fore more in different types of organizations. So bigger organizations versus smaller organization, or crisis versus business as usual. Certain risks and categories might be elevated or diminished in those times. Your job is just to examine the categories of risk that we use in those different organizational settings, the things that are most relevant for different settings. 1.4, analyze organizational methods for managing and quantifying risk. Indicative content here, it could be that we look at some probability mapping. We need to find, how do we organizationally manage to find where the risks actually are and how big the risks are, and to think about how we kind of manage the risk as we go through as well. So we need to measure stuff, you might think. We need to think about how we're performing compared to industry norms or sector norms and standards, those kind of things. It may be that we are managing risk through adherence to quality standards, so again, ISO type of frameworks, etc. I think it'd be useful again to bring this into your lived experience, look at your own organization and what it does in methods for managing and quantifying risk, and maybe bring those in here. But your job is not to just to list the different methods, but to analyze them as well. So to analyze, again, just reminders, it's breaking into separate parts, examining those things in detail, look at the main issues, reference any current research or theories along the way as we can. So don't just list the methods, but analyze them is the key thing here. We need to do that thing of both quantifying how big we think the risks are, but also something towards managing those risks as well. That needs to go in 1.4. Second learning outcome, we're now going to understand the process for managing business risk. So we're really going to laser in on that managing business risk thing next. 2.1 then, analyze the processes for identifying, assessing and ranking business risk. If it was me, I'd be looking to do a separate paragraph of process for identifying business risk, a separate paragraph for assessing the business risk, and a separate paragraph for ranking the business risk. You've got all those three things covered in your answer. It might be worthwhile looking at your own organizations and what you know here to help. If not, you can use other case studies and other examples that you're aware of or you can bring in. But you've got to look at the process and analyze the processes. Our assessment of the risk, what is it? Is it good? Where does it fall down? Where's it weak points? Where are the gaps in our knowledge around the assessment of risk? Are we ranking risk correctly, adequately, benchmarking, good practice, formal methods, all that kind of thing? Usually with ranking and assessment, there's a little bit of science and art in that because it's kind of what people think very often. So do we have an effective method for us collaboratively or a senior team to look at the risk, analyze it effectively, and then rank how important the risk really is for us? To make sure you've covered all those three things: identifying, assessing, and ranking the business risks around the place and the processes it gets there. 2.2, analyze the process for managing our business risk. So you're going to take one of those risks that we identify around your organization and look at what is the process around managing that risk. Is it adequate? Does it fall down? Again, are there gaps in that? Are we monitoring, managing costs around it? Have we got the right technology leveraged against the risk? Are we upskilling staff against the risk effectively? Are we stress testing it? Are we looking at what happens in different scenarios around the risk. There's a bit of the process around managing our business risk, a specific business risk. What is the process? Analyze it, pick it apart a little bit. 2.3 then, examine approaches for mitigating a business risk. When you've analysed the process of a business, it would make sense then to use the same business risk here for what might be the different ways in which then we could mitigate for that risk. How could we better manage the risk once we've analysed the process that we're currently using? So overall, there could be something in the process itself that isn't quite right. We don't know enough about the risk, or we're not on top of it and measuring it enough. But overall, what could we do, and what several things might we do on that risk to try to reduce its likelihood of occurring, or our ability to or improve our ability to deal with it as and when it does. So this could be, again, practically, it could be how that risk is transferred between maybe different contractual parties, you and a supplier, you and a customer. Where's the balance of risk between the parties on the thing? Could be, very often a good thing to think about here. It could be insurances against it. It could be how we contingency plan against it. It could be prediction of risk. It could be trialing and testing of small areas where it might fall down and kind of practicing what happens then before we get to a big thing. It could be avoidance of risk altogether and offshoring it somehow, getting rid of it somehow. So you can identify 2, 3 specific different types of approaches for mitigating a specific business risk here, and pick apart those different approaches in some detail, not just list them, but pick them apart, examine them is the command verb. 2.4, analyze methods for implementing business risk management. So this is the wider piece here a little bit in terms of the business and how we make sure that we're able to get risk on the agenda and implement business risk management effectively. That might come from leadership, top-down influence, policy and structures and procedures. It could be that, again, that governance piece to tighten that up so that we've got clearer lines of responsibility and accountability for more stuff. Often risk happens between the gaps between different roles or people where nobody wants to really own it, so it doesn't get owned. And I think to manage risk effectively is not the same thing as eliminating all risk everywhere. That's really important. So are we using the right level of risk mitigation and management on the right type of risk is a good question maybe to be looking at here as you analyze methods. Do you have a different department to do risk, or do you do risk within departments? None of these things are, absolute. There are different ways to do risk, but I think to look at generally how a business or your business might implement business risk management really effectively, we're looking at 2, 3 different methods only, specifically to do with implementing business risk management. You're going to analyze each of them, pick them apart in some detail, and perform an analysis of those methods. And finally, 2.5, assess methods for reporting identified risk to stakeholders. So here we haven't looked at that term stakeholders before, I don't think, in the assignment. So might be a thing to do to think about defining what we mean by stakeholders really clearly, what kind of different stakeholders might be around the business that are impacted by risk, and then reporting identified risk to them. So we've got a list of what the risk could be. What do we or could we do to report those risks to stakeholders around the place? So there could be some KPIs, some metrics, for example, you use here. It could be some ongoing narrative around what we're doing around the risk, what we're doing to improve or mitigate risk around the place to satisfy those stakeholders. Often in a risk environment, what external auditing bodies or key stakeholders are looking for is not that all risk is completely eliminated, but that the organisation has a credible plan of how to identify and mitigate the risks that it comes across. That is often the kind of what we're looking for in health and safety and those kind of areas. So what are the different stakeholders define those things around risk in particular? And then in what ways might we report identify risk to them is what we're trying to do. And the assessment comes into place here. This is the command verb where we're going to provide a reason, judgment or rationale of the standard, quality, value or importance of something, informed by relevant facts or rationale. So here you might think around 2, 3, maybe 4 at most different types of method for reporting identify risk. Your job is to assess the methods of reporting. So how good do you think they are? What can the problems be sometimes around them? Which is the most effective method for different stakeholders? All those things come into play here for 2.5. And that is this assignment. Don't forget, overall, we're looking for a good balanced view of what risk is, how we govern it, how we identify it, rank it, approach mitigation measures, communicate those to stakeholders overall, and try to think of bringing your lived experience in from your own roles or organizations here to help you as you fill in those little bits of context and story throughout the assignment.
Thanks very much, James. We hope that you found this useful. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me on cmi@inpd.co.uk. We look forward to receiving your assignments soon.